With David, I'm able to get 28 grams of protein with the calories of a snack, which makes it very easy to hit my protein goals of 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight each day. And it allows me to do that without taking in excess calories. I typically eat a David bar in the early afternoon or even mid-afternoon if I want to bridge that gap between lunch and dinner. I like that it's a little bit sweet, so it tastes like a tasty snack, but it's also giving me that 28 grams of very high quality protein with just 150 calories. If you would like to try David, you can go to davidprotein.com/Huberman. Again, the link is davidprotein.com/Huberman. Today's episode is also brought to us by Levels. Levels is a program that lets you see how different foods affect your health by giving you real-time feedback on your diet using a continuous glucose monitor. One of the most important factors in both your short and long-term health is your body's ability to manage blood glucose or blood sugar. To maintain energy and focus throughout the day, you want to keep your blood glucose steady without big spikes or crashes. I first started using Levels about 3 years ago as a way to understand how different foods impacted my blood glucose levels. And it's proven incredibly informative for determining my food choices, when I eat specific foods, and how I time eating relative to things like my workouts, both weight training and cardiovascular training, things like running, and when to eat before I go to sleep to allow for the most stable blood sugar throughout the night. Indeed, using Levels has helped shape my entire schedule. So if you're interested in learning more about Levels and trying a CGM yourself, you can go to levels.link/Huberman. Levels has just launched a new CGM sensor that is smaller and has even better tracking than before. Right now, they're also offering an additional 2 free months of membership. Again, that's levels.link, spelled LINK/Huberman, to try the new sensor and 2 free months of membership. And now for my discussion with Dr. Jordan Peterson. Dr. Jordan Peterson, welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Delighted to have you here, and want to talk about elements within your new book.
Yeah.
Also some elements within your previous books, and within that mind of yours generally.
You'll need a top-notch team
As a
to win
framework
this
for that,
one.
I'm wondering if you would tolerate or permit a little bit of a discussion about sort of brain and psychology, just kind of lay the groundwork for where we might prod some of the themes that you bring up related to the book. So I view the brain as obviously a bunch of cells and parts, etc., but I distill it down to some basic features. First of all, we have an autonomic physiology. I think we both agree on that. That regulates our sleepiness and wakefulness, our breathing, our heart rate, stuff that runs in the background.
Doesn't belong to. Who are you calling a
And then we have a
raccoon,
lot of
huh?
circuitry devoted to what I would call impulses, things that we desire, we want to move toward, appetitive behaviors.
30 seconds before you attack.
We also have
Get ready.
some impulses to avoid things that are putrid, painful, etc. That's all in there, like it is in the
We should
original.
talk about that characterization.
Okay.
Because there's an important point to be made on that. You pay a price for characterizing that as impulse, and I'd like to explore that with you because it's crucial.
Great, we'll circle
The battle
back to
starts in
impulse. I'd like to
5,
do that.
4,
And then we have a
3,
lot of circuitry.
2,
People will hear about it as executive function, prefrontal circuitry, which does
get
many
that vehicle
things.
to its
But
destination.
I like to think of as a circuit that can say, and here I'm borrowing from a previous guest, a neurocircuit, it can say,
Dr. Padil.
or exert what's called top-down suppression on these, what I'm calling.
Talk.
We should talk about that too, the suppression idea, the inhibition idea in general,
Great.
because I think there's a parallel.
Don't mind me. Not just dying. You're ready for
Great.
action.
So circuitry that's devoted to our ability to self-inhibit the desire to reach for something or to avoid something. We can push ourselves into things that would otherwise be aversive. We can avoid doing things that would otherwise drive us to, quote unquote, just do it anyway. And then we have what I think of as our
Nah, they have
default
Iron Man now.
settings, kind of how we're operating in the world with respect to food, other people, ourselves, our thoughts.
They're playing triple support.
Intervene with ourselves.
Get the card
And these
moving,
default
boys.
settings are, of course, established by Mother Nature, a genetic program that wires up circuitry, but also nurture because of the immense neuroplasticity that occurs in the first 25 years plus of life, but especially in
Feeling fantastic. Almost
and then,
there.
of course, we have
Don't turn it
neuroplasticity,
down.
this incredible gift that humans have, more of than any other species as far as we know, which is
Ah, no.
we can psych- Now, the reason I bring up this starting with the question is because there are so many amazing questions that you can ask in this book. we who wrestle with God, I'm trying to wrap our arms and minds around this huge set of questions. And it occurred to me just to step back from all of that
The vehicle
and
reached
ask,
the checkpoint.
is
Keep up
part of
your
the
momentum.
reason that we have a concept of God, that there are multiple religions, is that the consequence of some humans at some point realizing, or perhaps God himself realizing, that what we are equipped with as humans, which we just described, is insufficient to allow us to evolve as a species.
The god of thunder!
I think this for me really is like the central question of at least my life, which is to what extent do I need to intervene with my default settings, rewire them, engage that prefrontal cortex and push down on some repetitive or aversive behaviors? And to what extent can we do that? Maybe,
And to what end?
and to what end? And maybe we need a rule.
Still the best at what you do, Logan.
I
Kill Iron Man. Iron Man. I'm trying, man. He's getting pocketed
that
right now.
we need a rule that the neural circuitry
That Matt is just constantly pocketing him.
is not
So
sufficient
fucking hard.
to allow us to navigate through life to our
They have a storm now.
You kind of know that we need a rule book, even
They're also triple heal, okay?
in some ways implicitly when you discuss the fact that we have 25
Feel the wrath of the
And
goddess!
what that means is that
We are undefeatable! I am ready to put on a show!
that's so complex here. And so we're learning something from it. And that's educational are insufficient
Nah.
into the future.
Rocket again!
Right.
Well,
And
we
so
might
then
have
the
to
question
have.
is,
I
well,
don't
what
know.
is it that you're learning as a consequence of that socialization process? And you can think about it, and people have thought about it as
Rocket better can go
series
cloak and
of
dagger.
complex inhibitions of lower order motivation states, impulses. But I'm not very happy with the inhibition model because inhibition is
Bro, he's
unsophisticated socialization. Integration is sophisticated socialization. So here's a way of, I really learned this, I think, from contrasting
Rocket on and go cloak and dagger.
because Freud's model certainly is really an inhibition model, and Freud was a neurologist. Piaget's model is very different. He thought of the properly socialized person as someone who had integrated their lower order, we'll call them impulses for now, into a sustainable voluntary structure that regulated them and gave them all their proper rights. That's very different than an inhibitory model. So, for example, I'll give you an example. Like, my son is quite a
Behold the god of thunder! This is real fire!
fair enough. My father, formidable character. So my son liked to do what he liked to do, and it took him quite a bit of tussling to help him. I wouldn't say inhibit that or regulate, to integrate. And one of the consequences of that was he became a very good athlete.
Undefeatable!
And so why is that relevant? Well, because it wasn't like he stopped being assertive or even aggressive. It's that he learned how to put that aggression in its proper place in relationship to a goal that is much more sophisticated than merely getting his own way moment to moment. Okay, so integration is better.
Feel the wrath of
A
the
very
goddess!
sophisticated athlete team isn't non-aggressive. And they're not
Oh,
inhibited
Rocket, please,
from
Fab,
aggression on
dude.
playing
Rocket,
field.
please.
Now and then when they're provoked, let's say, but
For the
all
love of
things
God,
considered,
stop off,
what they've
man.
done is subordinate their aggression
Magic
to a higher
is
order
not
goal
60 seconds
that
left.
enables them
Yeah,
to
there-
be
there's
more
no point in fucking
successful,
continuing,
but also
man.
to be successful in a maximally social and sustainable way. And Piaget's point, and he's absolutely right about this, is that that's much better conceptualized as integration. And then with regard to the impulse, because I said I would return to that, I spent a lot of time walking through the behavioral literature, right? And a lot of that was derived from animal experience, and it was predicated on the idea
medicine.
that if you could explain something on the basis of deterministic you should. There's something to be said for that. A pure theory
I am ready to put on a show!
how far can you get with the chain reflex? The behavior is going the way. They couldn't get to the highest strata of human endeavor, but there was a lot of things they did that were very good. But one of the things they made a big mistake about was to conceptualize motivational states, let's say, as impulses
You'll have to
or
keep fighting
drives.
until we have a winner.
That's not sufficient because fails to take
the
into
god
account
of
the
thunder!
effects on perception. So it's much better to think of this is what helped me integrate behavioral theory and psychology, especially
Caught in the back, caught in the back, caught in the back.
From the goddess!
endeavor. It's much better to think of these lower order motivation states and personality. They're sub-personalities. They have their perception.
By the eye of Agamotto!
They have their cognitive rationalization. They have their emotions. They aren't small.
We have to open, we have to open.
Very narrow-minded. Like a personality.
So are they personalities within our, what most people would think of as our larger personality? I mean, what I'm hearing is that, let's say somebody's an athlete.
Depends on how integrated you are. Because you could be nothing but a succession of dominion of sub-personalities. That's what a two-year-old is.
I have my
Right? And so you have to build entities or thoughts, but not in a manner that inhibits it. Socialization is unsophisticated. Even Freud knew this, because even though he had basically inhibitory model of, say, super-ego regulation,
The
he
current score
believed
is
that a healthy personality would have the
0.
impulse of aggression and the impulse of
Time to
sexuality would
switch
take
things
two
up,
major
including which
lower order
side you're on.
motivational states into account, would have them
Open your
integrated
eyes.
into
Reality
the functioning
is but
ego.
an
The issue is
The right
integration.
heroes could make all
And so
the
what you're
difference.
doing when you're social, like, okay, when my son, for example, would become willful in a manner that I regarded as counterproductive for him and the household. And the rule would be, you can't act that way, because if you act that way, people aren't going to approve of you, and that's a bad plan. So you have to control that, because it's not going to work out well for you if you don't. Okay, so I use timeout. Now, timeout is an effective disciplinary strategy for social creatures, because we don't like isolation. And so timeout basically takes the child, puts the child in isolation. That produces
We'll
a
be coming in 30
pain-like
seconds.
response, because
Stay
social
strong.
isolation produces
It's pure
pain.
inhibition.
Well, that's the question. You see, that's the question. He had to inhibit his immediate desire, say, to run around, because he was going to sit on the steps. But
Can we just
see,
focus on
I
what
put a
we're
rule
doing
in
here?
place there, and the rule was, as soon as you get yourself under control, you can leave the stairs. Okay, so now the question is, what
The
does
battle
under
starts in
control
5,
mean?
4,
One interpretation
3,
is inhibition.
2,
Another
1.
interpretation is no. He's developing a super-organized personality called the cortical that has enough dominion so that those underlying motivational states can now be integrated and placed properly into a hierarchy. And when I'm insisting that he regulate his behavior, and I allow him to take off the step when he is now able to be a social creature again, instead of orchestrating his whim, I'm reinforcing the cortical integration of those underlying motivational states. Now, you might think that human organism comes into the world with a warring battleground by motivational states. That's perfectly reasonable view. We know a lot of that is mediated by the hypothalamus, for example. The amygdala, these lower order, biologically, pre-programmed, to some degree, pre-programmed systems. Now, the specific manner in which those systems should find their expression, and the specific way that they're going to be hierarchically integrated, is going to depend to a tremendous degree on the particulars of the society at that moment, which is why you need that 18-year framework to hold the manner in which those systems make themselves manageable. I think the best way to conceptualize that is that it's the hierarchical integration of
Maximum pulse!
within an overarching superorganized personality. And that personality is not bound to the moment. It takes the medium and long term into account. And it's not self-serving like a 2-year-old would be, because you have to take other people into account if you're going to be successful. So, and this is where the cortex comes in as far as I'm concerned. This is what it's doing. It's stretching it's integrating the lower order, temporally bound motivational states that are specifically self-serving to a much broader vision.
Feel the wrath of the
Takes the
goddess!
future into account and other people. And that's hard. That's hard.
I love this, and I'll tell you why. because
This is
the way that I
real
think of the
firepower!
is that its main job is context-dependent strategy.
The god of thunder!
Context-dependent. And you mentioned hypothalamus, it's the size of 2 marbles or so sitting above the roof of our mouth. Tiny, tiny little brain area. It's mostly switches. What do I mean by that? Anytime a neurosurgeon has stimulated neurons in a little sub-area of the
All eyes
hypothalamus, you
over
get
here.
either rage or sexual appetite or mating with inanimate objects. I mean, this was done in non-human primates and in humans. Uncontrollable thirst, hunger, total suppression of hunger. I mean, all the basic drives are operating there like switches. And prefrontal cortex has direct access to the hypothalamus. And prefrontal cortex is context-dependent learning, context-dependent decision-making. And I love that you brought in this notion of changing.
I am ready to put on a
impulse.
show.
Example that you gave me, your son's impulse to be aggressive or wild in some way that was inappropriate for the home environment at that moment. And 2 things that you said really resonate. The prefrontal cortex, his prefrontal cortex, had to learn that whatever he was feeling for himself, his own desires, needed to be placed in the context of other people's wishes, desires, and needs as well. So there's
Even for him, it's not merely a sacrifice of his desire for the sake of others. It's like we know this. If you have the same orientation towards other people at 4 that you did when you were 2, especially if you're tilting in the opposite direction, you will not make friends and you will be isolated and alienated for the rest of your life. So that 2-year-old impulsiveness that has its place. 2, it starts to modify radically at 3. And it better be fixed by 4. And the reason for that is that you have to integrate yourself into the social world, which means, in the case of children, it means you want to have friends. And so the reason you're disciplining your child isn't to teach them that what they're doing is bad, in that simple, in that simple sense that you might interpret punishment. It's like, no, you need to be more sophisticated. Well, why? Well, you have to be able to take turns. Well, why? Well, because no one will like you otherwise. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, first of all, we're hyper-social. Like, you can punish psychopaths by putting them in isolation. That's how social human beings are. You take the most antisocial human beings there are, and you can punish them by making them be alone. Right, so that's how social we are. So you want to, you're modeling for your child a strategy of even satisfaction for his own basic drives that takes context in the most sophisticated possible way into account, right? And that is, see, as soon as you understand that that's the fostering of like a meta personality in the child, which would really be the personality of that child, the integrated personality, you start to understand how that might be related to religious thinking, because religious thinking is the attempt to formulate something approximating an ideal personality. Right now, that's attributed there. That's often attributed elements of the divine. There's reasons for that we can go into. But as soon as you know that the basic structure, even at the lower motivational level, is personality, well, then that changes the way you view the brain. Look, a lot of archaic deities are motivation systems.
Could you give me an example?
Well, the god of war, Mars, that's rage. That was a god that the Vikings invoked before they went into battle. They would use Amanita muscaria, and they imitated predators, like
So
from an early age.
This is acetylcholine, by the way, folks, has 2 general receptor systems, the nicotinic system, which is a stimulant but also relaxes you. That's why people like nicotine. And then the muscarinic system, which creates changes in our self-perception and perception of the things around us. It's not so much a stimulant as I would veer towards almost like a psychedelic, or it has an effect of making us less
You'll need a
fearful
top-notch team to win
and
this
intrigued.
It's a radically atypical psychedelic.
Yeah, it's hard to describe.
It's outside the LSD, psilocybin, mescaline domain.
So people would take this as an agent. The Vikings would take this as an agent before going into.
Sure, because what they were trying to do is make the personality of rage superordinate, with no pain. Right, and they practiced that from a very early age. So the Vikings worked themselves up. They went berserk. That means to wear the bare shirt. Right, they transform themselves, so to speak, into predators.
They would narrow the context within which they're, I'm calling them impulses, but you're given a more sophisticated explanation for them, within which the aggressive impulse, the strategically aggressive impulse could be channeled.
Right,
Because that
give full reign, give it full reign.
Open your
They were
eyes.
experts.
to be able to decapitate people, eviscerate people, do whatever it was that they needed to do in order to and to suppress their own feelings.
Yeah, well, then you could imagine in a way that what they were doing was bringing the full resources of the cortex to and placing them at the service of the rage surface in the hypothalamus. Like, we have no idea what that would be like. No, there are, we don't do that. We have no idea what a human being who does that is
All you
like.
need to do
They're
is capture the mission area. Got it?
you, you would give you nightmares to think about it deeply.
There's an experiment, if I may, that might shed some light on what it would look like. A former guest on this podcast, actually, David Anderson, has been studying neural circuits, and he and his former postdoc, Dai Yun, discovered a small, tiny collection of neurons in the ventromedial hypothalamus that, when stimulated, would send these animals, these mice, you can find videos of this online, into a rage. Now, the interesting thing is it required the presence of animals.
Right.
And or somewhat context dependent, if they were alone in their cage, they didn't attack themselves or the walls of the cage. But if you put a air or water-based glove with your eye, they would absolutely attack to try and destroy it. Then you turn off these neurons, analysis comes. You can put a link to this in the show notes caption. Now here's what's remarkable. The ventromedial hypothalamus has these neurons basically interspersed with other neurons that can stimulate, suppress rage, and activate copulation. Incredible, right? Within the same structure, you have these
Maximum pulse!
neurons in the behaviors. And it speaks to, I think, some of the things that Freud and others have talked about in terms of the juxtaposition of these neurons, but that they mutually inhibit, which lends itself to some really interesting questions about when those two, when aggression and sexuality combine in states of pathology. But in any event, so context-dependent control over the hypothalamus seems to be being here. And the other thing that you mentioned is the ability for your son in this case, but presumably also the lichens, to be able to broaden their temporal scope, to be able to think about the time domain. This is something I'm absolutely obsessed by. The more we experience, what I brought up at the beginning was that we have this autonomic arousal system. The more alert we are, the less we are able to take ourselves into notions of this too shall pass. Past the present. Sure. Attention. Autonomic activation. Stress. Lose sight of the fact that there's a present.
Yes, well, that's because they're collapsing apprehension to the moment, so you will act. You have to collapse to the moment to act. Right, and so we should also point out for everyone that you don't want to underestimate the sophistication of hypothalamus, and this is partly why conceptualizing its various states as subpersonalities is so useful. I mean, it's not unsophisticated. You can take a female cat and take out its whole brain, except for the hypothalamus. So it's like nighttime. It's strong.
Maximum pulse!
It's indistinguishable from a normal cat.
Again!
You can do cat things and live. And it's hyper exploratory. Now that's cat is hyper exploratory. It's not what she thinks at all, but it shows you how sophisticated hypothalamus is. It can run these programs, but they're programs of personality because they have perception. It can run them. And it can do that quite successfully. Now, all the higher subcortical systems are, well, I think they are, to your point, they're ways of expanding the apprehension of those fundamental motivational systems across broader and broader incorporating more and more people, but also solving the problem of conflict that emerges between those fundamental motivational states. Right? It's like, well, what do you do when you're hungry and right? Well, you have to mediate the states free. What do you do if you want to solve the problem of you're hungry and tired over a long period of time with other people? Right? Well, you need more and more brains to time. Right? And so a huge part of what maturation is when you think about it as being past
Maximum punch!
actually mature. The cortex comes along. You're able to regulate your brain more and more other things in your house. Right. And, you know, that there has to be some reward.
Vehicle reached the checkpoint. Keep up the
It's
momentum.
also the case that you do have to satiate yourself in relationship to your basic biological needs or you die. So there's going to be tension, and that is something like the tension between group. You so enjoyed it. So we're here to talk about that. It's not useful to identify your individuality and win. And that's what he is. Sure, people. Why should I get what I want? I see. So your claim is that you, that superorgan, is what you want. That isn't correct. That means you're subjugating these low-order personalities. And you might say, well, why is that wrong? You're a 2-year-old. It doesn't work. You know, if it's all about you and your immediate gratification, well, first of all, you're psychopathic. You can think of psychopathy as an extension of the adult. That's a pretty good default way of conceptualizing. It's like, it's an
Will you grab a shot? Give me a go.
They want what they want in life.
regardless.
And they don't care about the
This one of the ways I thought relationships, because I studied antisocial behavior for a very long time. Psychopaths in particular are notorious for their inability to learn from experience. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that if they do something impulsive that causes them trouble in the future, the fact of that trouble has no bearing on their individual. What that means is that they are so non-utilitarian that they're willing to
Maximum punch!
betray their own future self.
Alright, bro,
There's no
let's
difference
go.
between that and betraying someone else. It's exactly the same.
very much a
Well, so here's something I did in Montreal. I worked with Richard Tremblay, and Richard's lab used up 1/3 of all social science funding for Quebec at one time. Radically successful.
Get that vehicle moving again!
He was really interested in antisocial behavior and was trying to get to the roots. And one of the conclusions that our lab moved to take 2-year-olds, take kids at different ages,
Disappear!
4-year-olds, all the way up to 15. You just let them. The 2-year-olds are the most aggressive. And, but if you analyze all these kids are boys, and it's only a fraction of them, about 5%. So if you group 2-year-olds together, 5% were boys that kick, steal, hit, and bite, which was our definition of early on. Almost all of those kids are socialized. Right. The remnant that aren't get alienated because they have no friends, and they're the ones who become juvenile delinquents, and then early onset criminals, and then repeat offenders. Right. And so what it is when there's some kids whose default
Sure.
their rage circuits are a little bit more dominant. They're often bigger.
Yeah, especially the biting. Give me for interrupting. There's a very interesting paper published 2 years ago showing that there's a specific circuit from the hypothalamus to the neurons that are independent of jaw closure for eating and for drinking that are specifically for aggressive fighting. I mean, I hope people understand the significance of this because what this means is there are dedicated circuits for aggressive fighting. We all learn to
The current
suppress
score
this, except
is
probably under conditions
2-2.
where our life is endangered, in which case you probably bite like hell in order to try and get out of that
Time to
circumstance.
switch things up,
But
including
we are all
which
born with
side
this
you're
circuit.
on.
We die with this circuit. Most of
Be
us,
wary.
apparently not
No
these kids, learn to
timeline
suppress this
exists where
circuit.
Magneto
Right.
or
An 8-year-old
The right
biter
heroes could make
is a
all the
scary.
difference.
Right.
A 1-year-old biter is like a little bit of a worrisome thing. A 2-year-old, like, okay, we need to work on this.
Yeah.
An 8-year-old biter, People are
Right.
starting to be concerned.
Open
I think
your eyes.
even without knowledge of the
Reality is
psychopathology
but an
literature,
illusion.
one would be very concerned if their 8-year-old is biting other kids.
Right.
Not just because of the damage induced, but it's so very different. And
Well, it's
so
so
much more
primordial.
primitive than even hitting or spitting or something.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
the indication
But to
of
be felt,
of virtual
experienced,
absence of sophisticated socialization.
They are
Right.
truly in their hypothalamus.
Yeah, right, exactly. And that's, well, especially if you have a hypothalamus that's tilted towards rage, let's say, and
We'll be coming in
defensive
30
or
seconds.
predatory
Stay
aggression.
strong.
That's bad news. Now, so
I need you to promise that you'll
so
show some
so what's
restraint
the
out there, Johnny.
upshot of that? Well, the upshot is that there is a that's right. There's a subset of kids whose default reactions aren't socialized, and we associate that with psychopathy and long-term criminality. It's a really useful
battle
thing to
starts in
understand
5,
that much of
4,
what we see as
3,
pathology,
2,
and I would say the same thing
1.
about narcissism and
You have to stop
certain
them from
forms of
securing the
hedonism,
mission area.
essentially what it is failure of socialization. Right? And this has very interesting political implications because it also implies that, imagine that impulsive self-gratification is a personality. The desire for impulsive self-gratification is a
Nothing here.
personality with its own political opinion. Nietzsche said in relation to Hunter that every dry attempt to philosophize it's brilliant. Far different from conceiving say hypothalamic drives as determinism or change of only impulses. And another thing to consider too with regards to the effect of hypothalamic motivation on perception, that mouse that you talked about whose attack system is active in astronomy. See, when that glove is dropped, you can see that there's a relationship with perception. Because if there's no target for attack that's biologically relevant in the environment, there's no interest. So you can imagine what happens to neurons is a set of
Maximum pulse!
stimuli that are much more likely to be classified. Now, even a glove, right? Drop a glove, that's now perceived as a defeatable enemy. But then you see, then it's the perception driving the behavior. That's not an impulse, right? That's more like a strategy. And I really started to understand some of the literature on the evolution of religious thinking. I started to understand motivations and personality. Because one of the things that we'll see is so cool. Something I tried to talk to daughters about. The greatest historian of religions who ever lived was Mircea Eliade, and he wrote a sequence of brilliant books. The Sacred and the Profane is the best one to start with. Very
Mortal
short, book,
pain is
very
no
elegant.
match for the
And
Sorcerer
what
Supreme.
Eliade documented across the world was the pattern by which polytheistic belief systems turned into monotheistic. They're ahead of us. That parallels
Stop that vehicle in its tracks.
it's the same thing. And so the polytheistic gods tend to be representations of motivation.
I'm going to pause here because I think this is
I am strengthened.
Stop that vehicle.
so the god of war.
Or the god of love. Exactly that.
So the idea that different gods are reflected.
Maximum pulse!
We'll just say it as neuroscience. And
Beware of becoming their acquaintance. And the other thing that's very interesting is that you have to also understand that these things exist independently of historical context. So let's say rage.
By the eye of Agamotto!
There's a culture of rage. There are patterns of rage that are played out in graphic literature. Like, it's not only the motivation and impulse, it's personality. It's personality with
The
history and
Sorcerer
a philosophy.
Supreme lives
And
once
if
more.
you don't think it can possess you, you don't know very much about possession. So, like, for example, if you're fighting with someone and you become enraged, as you said, your temporal purview shrinks, and your notion of what constitutes victory is radically transformed. So if you're fighting with someone you love, you might want to defeat them, or even independently. Well, then you think, well, you're gripped by these impulses. No, you're inhabited by the spirit of rage. And if you're a sophisticated person, there's going to be
Maximum pulse!
an endless stream of sophisticated intellectual rationalizations that come along with that possession. Right? It's full-fledged personality, and it's one of the things you
Sorcerer
see with people
Supreme
who are
returns.
psychotic, who drift off into the landscape of their imagination, is that they dwell on such states of possession. So, for example, these kids that shoot up high schools, like they're fantasizing under the influence of rage and resentment for thousands of hours. That just takes control of them, and it's not a simple impulse. It's like, no, they've inverted they've inverted the neurological order, and the god of rage is now what would you say, the leading personality of integration, or the god of resentful rage, even worse.
And this circuit may run in reverse. My colleague David Spiegel, who's our vice chair of psychiatry, has done some beautiful experiments examining the relationship between prefrontal cortical areas and insula, a brain area that has a map of our internal body state, interoception, organs, etc. Many of them, there are certain conditions, including depression, where the direction of flow of the prefrontal cortex and the insula literally reverses. It's like running against the typical track. This is a very different example in the context of rage or sociopathy, these kids who shoot up schools.
Maximum
But I do
pulse!
absolutely subscribe to what you just said, that if one drops into one of these more primitive states and emotions and all the things that go on in the brain all the time, it's almost as if the governor, which is the prefrontal cortex, starts to become the governor. That the whole circuit starts to run from bottom up as opposed to top down. And I think there's good neurological evidence. Again,
So you hit that circuit that's seeking the drug.
Keep your
with
balance,
repeated
you two.
doses.
Stay in control.
People say they have a monkey on their back. It's like, no, they have a monster in their brain, and they
Down to
grew
30
it,
seconds.
and it grows because it's reinforced with dopaminergic hits, and as it grows, its capacity to dominate increases. And so when there's a cue for
My
the
life
addiction,
force
this is
is
why people
fading.
relapse after
I
they get out
require
of the treatment
urgent
center.
treatment.
They'll go back to their normal environment after having dealt with physiological withdrawal. And a cue created will make itself manifest like a friend or a base will. And it's all of a sudden, boom, that monster is alive. It just shuts it down. And it's got a personality. It can lie. One of the hallmarks of and the lies are the rational.
By the eye of Agamotto!
Such personality for its own pathological behavior. So, and that's all reinforced too by the dopaminergic hits.
it's like there's multiple people in every one. One of the most
By the
incredible
eye of
examples
Agamotto!
Final score.
Yeah, that's the
2,
default
2,
condition.
1.
Right. That's the condition of the 2-year-old.
I'd like to take a quick break and thank our sponsor, AG1.
Another
AG1 is an
epic
all-in-one
victory.
vitamin, mineral, probiotic drink with adaptogens. I've been taking AG1 daily since 2012, so I'm delighted that they're sponsoring this podcast. The reason I started taking AG1 and the reason I still take AG1 is because it is the highest quality and most complete foundational nutritional supplement. What that means is that AG1 ensures that you're getting all the necessary vitamins, minerals, and other micronutrients to form a strong foundation for your daily health. AG1 also has probiotics and prebiotics that support a healthy gut microbiome. Your gut microbiome consists of trillions of microorganisms that line your digestive tract and impact things such as your immune system status, your metabolic health, your hormone health, and much more. So I've consistently found that when I take AG1 daily, my digestion is improved, my immune system is more robust, and my mood and mental focus are at their best. In fact, if I could take just one supplement, that supplement would be AG1. If you'd like to try AG1, you can go to drinkag1.com/Huberman to claim a special offer. If you'd like to try AG1, you can go to drinkag1.com/Huberman to claim a special offer. Right now, they're giving away 5 free travel packs and a year's supply of vitamin D3 K2. Again, that's drinkag1.com/Huberman to claim that special offer. Today's episode is also brought to us by Roka. Roka makes eyeglasses and sunglasses that are of the absolute highest quality. I'm excited to share that Roka and I have teamed up to create a new style of red lens glasses. These red lens glasses are meant to be worn in the evening after the sun goes down. They filter out short wavelength light that comes from screens and from LED lights, the sorts of LED lights that are most commonly used as overhead and frankly lamp lighting nowadays. I want to emphasize, Roka red lens glasses
hero
are
do you
not
think you
traditional
wanna be
blue
today?
blockers. They're not designed to be worn during the day and to filter out blue light from screen light. They're designed to prevent the full range of wavelengths that suppress melatonin secretion at night and that can alter
Be
your
wary.
sleep. So by
No
wearing Roka red
timeline
lens glasses,
exists where
they help you
Magneto
calm down and they improve your
Now,
transition to
who
sleep.
am I gonna
Most
banish
nights
for
I
this
stay up
match?
until about 10 p.m. or even midnight, and I wake up between 5 and 7 a.m., depending on when I went to sleep. Now I put my Roka red lens glasses on as soon as it gets dark outside, and I've noticed a much easier transition to sleep, which makes sense based on everything we know about how filtering out short wavelengths of light can allow your brain to function correctly. Roka red lens glasses also look cool, frankly. You can wear them out to dinner or to concerts or out with friends. So it turns out it is indeed possible to support your biology, to be scientific about it, and to remain social after all. If you'd like to try Roka, go to roka.com, that's ROKA.com, and enter the code Huberman to save 20% off your first order. Again, that's ROKA.com and enter the code Huberman at checkout. One of the most remarkable real-life examples I've ever witnessed of the power of belief in God, I'm just going to say it as it occurred. I have a
right
good
heroes
friend
could make all the
who
difference.
for many years struggled with alcohol and drug addiction of multiple kinds. Incredibly kind person, incredibly successful in his career, married, 2 beautiful children, multiple relapses. Crashed his truck at 7 in the morning after getting intoxicated at 6:30 in the morning. Got out of that one, happened again and again, multiple rehab centers of this sort of standard treatment, etc. And then ultimately enough happened within that whole set of circumstances that his wife said, "This is it. You've got to solve this or we
To
just
hide
can't."
from the dangers that lie
A very scary
beyond our
situation for
shores.
everybody involved, including him, who absolutely
Coming in
adored his
30
family.
seconds. Stay strong.
He told us, his friends, that he was going to
Reed,
go to
you do have
a
a
center
plan to
here in
stop
Los Angeles
Victor, don't
that
you,
treats
darling?
addiction with essentially religion, a belief in God.
Of
He was
course.
already fairly religious.
But I would also be extremely
Most Sundays he attended church and things of that sort. And you can imagine we all thought, including myself, like,
The battle starts in 5,
okay, dude, like,
4,
good
3,
luck.
2,
I hope this works, but
1.
like, I would say 0
They
minus
are now.
his ability to get in space. He just had not
Earth's
succeeded.
magnetic field has been weakened by
He's been sober for 4 years. He got out of there,
much better.
and I wonder now whether something must have changed by adopting what is essentially a different incentive structure. Right, different incentive structure, but fear wasn't doing it before. Fear of extreme consequences, which were on the table at that time when he went in, weren't enough. Something about going and the work that he did there allowed him to then, it's almost like he got another prefrontal cortex, a more powerful prefrontal cortex. So maybe we could talk about that.
Well, that's not a bad way to think about what it is that people are trying to do in life.
This is real firepower!
You can invite in spirit that's hard to do, but that's what you do when you dwell on your rage. Right. Now imagine that you're doing that in the most positive direction. So what you're doing is you're generating a hypothesis about the mode of conduct and perception that would best
Behold the god of thunder!
and then establishing a relationship with that and inviting it. That's what the evangelical Protestants
Judge, jury, executioner!
target of my papers that I published. I knew the alcoholism very well, and the neurological very well. And it was known among alcoholism more that the most reliable treatment for alcoholism was religious. And this is well
Either time to stop them.
and I do believe that a huge part of that is incentive restraint. So you said, for example, your friend feels worse. Well, alcohol is good for anxiolytic drug, but it's also for people who don't have good reward source, like cocaine. If you're going to, you can't get rats addicted to cocaine. You need not. They have to be isolated in a cage until they're bar pressed to their own death for cocaine. So one of the things that substitute the incentive structure, right? Because the part of the addictive process is you fall into a false incentive pattern. Because cocaine makes you feel like you're doing something useful in respect to an important goal, even though you're not. It mimics that.
Even if you know you're not.
Even if you know it's
I know what I'm
irrelevant.
saying. I've never done cocaine. I'll be open about it. I think I like the emergent states enough that I'm very scared. Also, it wasn't around much. It wasn't a drug that was around much. But it's a remarkable drug in the sense that people who take cocaine seem to be excited about everything. And the brain becomes exceptionally good at finding cocaine.
Jury!
Pretty remarkable.
The god
Most people can't
of
find the thing or get the thing they want in the absence of the resources to get it. But people who take hard drugs somehow manage. Yeah, sure. Sometimes they
Find
lie
the pattern.
sometimes they lie, cheat, and
That's
steal.
extremely
Lie, cheat, and steal, but they'll do other things. They'll socialize with people so they don't have to lie. It's incredible to see that drug and things like methamphetamine take over people's minds. And now I'm thinking
the pathway appears when the aim is firmly in mind. Right? See, this is another insistence that's derived from the religious literature. So, because the idea there is that if your aim is upward, the pathway forward to that will make sense. That's what you just pointed out that is true in relationship to addiction. Right. Once you're in that realm of possessed personality, that will show itself to you, even under strange circumstances. Right, and it's partly because you can think of our perceptual systems and our emotional systems, for that matter, as navigating tools. Right, so now the addicted brain, see, the aim is possessed by the substance of addiction. Right, so now the highest form is cocaine, let's say. So now all pathways in the world are pathways to cocaine. All objects in the world are marked because it's just dominating, not just an impulse.
I am ready to put on a show.
That makes and emotion. And it comes to all the rationalization.
Judge!
brutal. That is about pornography. And the discussion around pornography is always related to the discussion around masturbation. Sorry, Rocket. But let's just talk about pornography in this context of these primitive drives and the circuits within the body, which we're all born with, that some of them are devoted to our progression as a species and reproduction. Zero question about that. Sexual behavior being not always, but certainly. All agree on that. I hope we can still all agree on that. Last time I checked, that's still true. A sperm and an egg met someplace in some context to create all of us. Okay, we're still grounded in that. Pornography is something that I hear quite a lot from typically young males, but sometimes young females, or even older females, who say that they can see themselves trying to resist the desire to orgasm. And it almost doesn't feel like desire. They're just in a compulsion that is almost unconscious, but they're just aware of the fact that they're, like an eating disorder, they're doing it, they know they shouldn't be doing it. And you can think about pornography has not been my thing, and I don't struggle with it. But when I hear from these people, it's so clear that they're asking, is it the prevalence of pornography out there? Or is it something really broken?
The current score is
like, are they broken?
0,
But
2,
I don't know that
3.
I would say after having the
Time to
discussion we've had
switch
thus
things
far
up,
that they're
including
broken.
which
It seems
side
to me
you're
that
on.
it's like as you said, it's the manifestation of one part of their.
Be wary.
It's one personality within them.
Where
Well, and
Magneto
it's been
You'll need
also
a top-notch
rewarded.
team to
So
win
you know,
this one.
when you see yourself moving towards the culmination of a
I
desired
will bring
goal,
peace to this
a
universe,
dopamine,
no matter the
that's
cost.
accompanied by dopamine release. Okay, and so two things, you know this, but everybody who's listening might not. There's two elements to that dopamine release. One is pleasure, but the other is that the dopamine. Imagine that there are circuits activated as you're acting. What the dopamine does is increase the probability that the circuits that were activated just before the positive experience happened grow. Okay, so now if you're engaged with pornography and that
30
culminates in,
seconds before you attack.
in
Get ready.
successful sexual satiation, which it can, that's what masturbation does,
I am
then
happy you're
the whole
here, Susan.
personality that's
You've
oriented
been a
toward
true
that set of
friend
stimuli
since I
is going to
first
become
emerged
dominant.
from my cocoon.
Very much like addiction.
Certainly come a long
Except
way
it's-
since the doctor who created you, Adam.
You know,
meant to use
there
me
has
as a
been
pawn in
there's
their
been
own
work
wicked
done
schemes.
with generally
But I
simpler
had a
animals
much
on
higher
this
calling.
phenomenon called super stimuli.
The
I think
battle
it's
starts in
stickleback
5,
fish where this was
4,
first observed.
3,
So males.
2, 1.
I hope I get this right, but I thought it was these male sticklebacks they're very aggressive towards other male sticklebacks, and the reason they're aggressive is because the other male sticklebacks have a red dot. They don't like red dogs at all. So you can really enrage a stickleback with a red dot. And these are red dots that's a little bigger and a little brighter than a typical red dot. You get a super stimulus. It's virtually irresistible to a stickleback. And it's weird because the maximal activation is produced by a stimulus that you wouldn't see in nature. It slightly exceeds. That's exactly what they're on. Super stimulus. Right, and it's not surprising that young males in particular are susceptible to that because male sexuality as a human being is very visually oriented.
You know you're always
Very.
safe with
And
me,
a lot of our brains are visually way more than virtually every other animal.
Sorry, you
Certainly
made this less better.
and every other mammal. And so we have a situation where any 13-year-old boy can
The moon
super stimulus in one day than the most successful man who ever lived 100 years ago would have ever seen in his whole life. Yeah, well, that's ecological. Radical.
Quantum
And, and it's worse because it's easily accessible for things to work. Right? So not only is it a super stimulus, it's one that's at hand.
I am ready to put on a show.
Judge, jury, executioner!
Yeah, sugar's back.
Yeah, you go into it. The other day I went into a gas station at the restaurant because I was traveling home for Thanksgiving, and I looked around and I thought, this isn't a convenience store. This is a
in this together.
everything that has chocolate also seemed to have caffeine, color,
The god of
everything.
thunder!
Not just sugar, but also caffeine and some other things that would provide stimulants. And you got nicotine and these things on their own aren't necessarily bad. I mean, one of these one elements in low enough doses and frequent use, etc. But maybe sugar being the one that clearly I think deserves deeper investigation, right? But it just occurred to me that
much different than the difference between manufacturing sugar and manufacturing cocaine.
You are the true
You
hero
take something
this day,
that's
Herbie.
available in its natural form in relatively low concentrations and purify
W heals. W healing key healers, by the way.
sugar has the same argument, the same pathological properties.
Well, I didn't think we were going to go over, but I think it's extremely appropriate and important that we do.
Oh my God!
So I know that you follow, but it's essentially an elimination for a number of years. You eat, right? I eat vegetables, fruit, and some starches. In any event, one thing that I is absolutely clear from following a clean diet of any kind, let's say the sort of is that very soon you're in the relationship between taste of the food, volume, macronutrients, so protein, fat, carbohydrates, micronutrients, and satiation. Which is, if you think about it, it's sort of like a rock or a big stick or something. The brain learns and the hypothalamus learns the association between taste and the content that else is in there and satiation.
Judge,
If you think
jury,
about highly processed ingredients,
executioner!
combinations of multiple ingredients, that's absolutely impossible to do. The brain can't.
I am ready to put on a
What
show.
are those things in there? How do they relate to my feelings of satisfaction? It's the difference between a super drug and what I believe are the elements that
This is real
that we have.
firepower!
Yeah.
learn about satiation.
The god of thunder!
Yeah, because in the context of these processed foods, we're activating multiple and gut. We know that the gut has neurons that can respond to sugar, fatty acids, and amino acid content. And there's this prominent theory that one of the main reasons we eat is to forage for amino acids. But we'll eat until we get enough of the essential amino acids. And we correlate that with taste, but that the gut has neurons, where we know the gut has neurons that signal through the vagus up through a little relay called the Nodo's ganglion. If you can look at it, fun name, and then up to the dopaminergic centers of the brain, which make us, when we eat something that has a high essential amino acid content, like a steak, a really tasty steak, the neurons in the gut, in a way that is independent of taste, are signaling to the brain,